They called her worthless and threw her out. She stood on a bridge, ready to end it all, but she was saved by a dying man who saw the queen they couldn't. My dears, this story is longer than usual, and it is very touching. I advise you to listen to it to the end and write how you liked it. The chill of the Memphis night air was a cruel joke, a physical manifestation of the ice that had encased my heart for months. It bit at my cheeks and crept under the collar of my worn-out coat, a coat Dwayne had once bought me for a Christmas that felt a lifetime away. Now, it was just another relic of a life that was no longer mine. The Hernando de Soto Bridge stretched out before me, a skeletal arc of steel and light against the inky blackness of the Mississippi River below. Down there, the water churned, a dark, indifferent void that promised a final, silent peace. It was a promise I was ready to accept. Each car that rumbled past, a blur of headlights and fleeting warmth, felt like a spectator to my final humiliation. They didn't know me. They didn't know the woman standing on the precipice was Celeste, a 58-year-old ghost haunted by the echoes of a 30-year marriage. They didn't know the word that had finally pushed me here. Cow. It was such a simple, ugly word, but in Dwayne's mouth it had become a weapon, sharpened over years of smaller cruelties. He'd hurled it at me last night, his face twisted with a contempt that had been simmering for years. "Look at you," he'd sneered, his eyes sweeping over the body that had borne him 2 children and held him through countless nights of sickness and worry. "You've let yourself become a cow, a fat, lazy cow. No wonder I found someone who actually cares about what she looks like." The someone was Tiffany, a girl barely older than our daughter, all taut skin, bleached blonde hair, and the kind of vapid smile that only youth can afford. She was standing right behind him in the doorway of my home, wrapped in my silk robe, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. They were a cliché, a walking, talking midlife crisis, and I was the punchline. He'd thrown a bag at my feet, a flimsy duffel filled with a random assortment of my belongings, and told me to get out. My home, my life, my dignity, gone. Just like that. The weight of it all pressed down on my shoulders, a physical force intent on pushing me over the railing. My fingers, numb with cold and sorrow, gripped the icy metal. I thought of my children, both grown and gone, living their own lives in other states. I had called them, my voice a broken whisper, but they were busy. "We'll call you back, Mom," they'd said, their voices tinged with the distracted patience of adults dealing with a parent's familiar drama. They didn't understand. This wasn't drama. This was the end. How could I explain that their father, the man who had taught them to ride their bikes and held my hand in the delivery room, had hollowed me out until there was nothing left but a shell of shame? What good was a mother who had been discarded like last week's garbage? Shame was a poison, and it had seeped into every part of me. It was the shame of knowing the neighbors heard the yelling. The shame of seeing the pity in the cashier's eyes at the grocery store when my credit card was declined because Dwayne had emptied the joint account. The shame of realizing the woman I saw in the mirror, with her tired eyes, the graying braids I hadn't had the energy to touch up, the soft roundness that spoke of too many meals eaten alone for comfort, was a stranger to me. I closed my eyes, the roar of the traffic and the whip of the wind a symphony for my despair. I leaned forward just a little, feeling the terrifying pull of the void. It would be so easy. A single step, a final breath, a release from the pain that had become my only companion. I wasn't just losing a husband. I was losing the very definition of myself. If I wasn't Dwayne's wife, who was I? If you've ever felt like your whole world was crumbling around you, you know the kind of silence that follows the storm. It's a silence so deep, you're not sure you'll ever hear another voice again. Little did I know, a voice was about to cut through that silence. A voice that would change everything. A screech of tires on pavement, loud and jarring, ripped through my morbid trance. It was so close it made me flinch back from the railing, my heart lurching in my chest. A pickup truck, a relic from another era with its rusted blue paint and rattling frame, had swerved to a halt just feet from where I stood. The engine coughed and sputtered like an old man on his deathbed. For a moment, I thought it was going to hit me. A final absurd cruelty from a universe that clearly had it in for me. The driver's side door creaked open and a man emerged. He wasn't large, but he moved with a solid, grounded presence that seemed to defy the chaos of the bridge. He was old, maybe 70 or more, with skin the color of rich, dark earth and a face carved with lines so deep they looked like a map of a long, hard life. He wore a worn denim jacket and a flat cap pulled low over his brow, but it was his eyes that held me. They were dark, piercing, and held no trace of pity. Only a kind of fierce, impatient intensity. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't ask what was wrong. He just walked straight towards me, his boots scuffing against the gravel on the walkway. "Don't you do it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the cold air. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. He reached me in 3 long strides, and before I could react, his hand, calloused and surprisingly strong, shot out and clamped around my wrist. His grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute. Unyielding. "Come on," he grunted, pulling me away from the railing with an authority that left no room for argument. "You're coming with me." I was too stunned to resist. I stumbled along beside him, a puppet whose strings had just been seized by a stranger. He opened the passenger door of the ancient truck and all but pushed me inside onto the cracked vinyl seat. The cab smelled of earth, oil, and something else. Something like old memories. He slammed the door, walked around, and climbed back behind the wheel. The engine protested with a groan before catching, and with a lurch, the truck pulled back into the flow of traffic, leaving the bridge and my final desperate plan behind us. I sat in stunned silence, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Who was this man? Where was he taking me? He drove with a quiet focus, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. We left the city lights of Memphis behind, plunging into the dark rural highways that led south deeper into the heart of the Mississippi Delta. The rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement was the only sound, a steady beat counting out the seconds of this strange new reality. I should have been terrified. I should have screamed, demanded to be let out, fought this strange abduction. But the truth was, the part of me that knew how to fight had died long before I ever set foot on that bridge. All that was left was a hollowed-out exhaustion, a surrender so complete that being taken by a stranger felt no different from being taken by the river. We drove for what felt like hours, though it might have been only one. The landscape flattened and darkened, the occasional porch light of a distant farmhouse the only break in the oppressive blackness. Finally, he turned off the main road onto a long gravel driveway flanked by ancient moss-draped oak trees whose branches clawed at the night sky. At the end of the drive was a house, a simple 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch and dark, unblinking windows. It looked like it had grown out of the very soil it stood on, weathered and stubborn. He pulled the truck to a stop and killed the engine. The sudden silence was even louder than the driving had been. For the first time since he'd pulled me from the edge, he turned and looked at me. His expression was stern, unreadable, but his eyes seemed to hold a flicker of something. Not kindness, not yet, but a deep, world-weary understanding. "You can fall apart in the morning," he said, his voice still that same low rumble. "Tonight, you're going to drink some tea and you're going to sleep in a warm bed. My sister's waiting up." He got out of the truck without another word, leaving me to grapple with the strangest turn my life had ever taken. I had gone to the bridge to die, but it seemed fate, in the form of a grumpy old man in a rusty pickup, had other plans. I didn't know it then, but I just met the man who would tear down the ruins of my old life and give me the tools to build a new one. The front door of the farmhouse opened before we even reached the porch steps, spilling a rectangle of warm, yellow light onto the overgrown yard. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was tall and broad-shouldered, her hair wrapped in a colorful scarf, her frame draped in a comfortable-looking house dress. As we drew closer, I could see her face, and it was the very antithesis of the man beside me. Where his features were sharp angles and stern lines, hers were soft, round, and etched with a gentle concern. This had to be his sister. The air of quiet, no-nonsense love that surrounded her was palpable, a comforting quilt in the cold, sharp night. She took one look at my face, at the tear tracks, the hollowed-out eyes, the deep, abiding despair I was sure was written all over me, and her expression softened further. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Some women, especially women of our age and color, can read a lifetime of pain in a single glance. She was one of them. "Silas, you get this child in here before she catches her death," she said, her voice rich and melodic like honey mixed with molasses. She held the door open wider and ushered me inside. The warmth of the house was immediate and enveloping. It smelled of cinnamon, old wood, and brewing tea. It was the smell of a home, a true home, not the sterile, loveless house I had just been cast out of. The living room was filled with mismatched but comfortable-looking furniture, shelves overflowing with books, and handmade quilts draped over every available surface. It was a room that had seen decades of life, of laughter and sorrow, and had absorbed it all into its very walls. It felt safe. I realized with a jolt that it was the first time I had felt safe in years. Miss Hetty, as Silas called her, guided me to a plush armchair near a crackling fireplace. "You just sit right there, sugar. Let me get you something warm." She disappeared into a kitchen at the back of the house, her movements efficient and full of purpose. Silas stood awkwardly by the door for a moment, his hat now held in his hands. He looked out of place in the warm domesticity of the room like a wild hawk brought indoors. He cleared his throat. "Hetty's a fusser," he mumbled, more to himself than to me. "Don't let her smother you." He then turned and walked down a short hallway, disappearing into a room and closing the door behind him, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the unfamiliar comfort of his sister's home. My body, which had been rigid with tension for what felt like an eternity, began to betray me. A deep, shuddering tremor started in my hands and spread through my entire being. The tears I thought I had no more of began to well up again, hot and thick. I was falling apart, right on schedule. Miss Hetty returned, carrying a steaming mug on a small tray. She set it down on a small table beside my chair. It wasn't just tea. It was a fragrant herbal concoction with a cinnamon stick floating on top. "Here now," she said softly, sitting on a worn ottoman across from me. "You drink this. It'll soothe your nerves." I picked up the mug with shaking hands, the warmth seeping into my frozen fingers. The first sip was like a balm to my raw, wounded soul. It was sweet, spicy, and utterly comforting. I drank it down, the hot liquid tracing a path of warmth all the way to the pit of my stomach, where a cold, hard knot of grief had been lodged for so long. She watched me, her gaze kind and patient. She didn't press. She just sat there, a silent, maternal presence, offering a space for my sorrow to simply exist without judgment. When I finished the tea and set the mug down, the tremors had subsided, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. I felt as if I had been carrying a mountain on my back and had just been allowed to set it down. "He found you on the bridge, didn't he?" she asked, her voice gentle. I could only nod, the shame of it washing over me again. "He does that sometimes," she continued, a sad, knowing look in her eyes. "Goes for drives when he can't sleep. He's got a sense for lost souls." She sighed, a deep, heavy sound. "My brother, why, he doesn't have much use for words, but he's got a good heart, buried under all that crust." She stood up. "The guest room is ready for you. You can get your bearings in the morning. Tonight, all you need to worry about is rest." She led me upstairs to a small, simple room with a large, inviting-looking bed covered in one of her handmade quilts. The sheets were clean and smelled of lavender. It was a haven, a sanctuary. For the first time that night I spoke. My voice was a croak, a rusty, unused thing. "Thank you," I whispered. Miss Hetty just smiled, a sad, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. There's no need for thanks, child. We all need a safe harbor in a storm. Now get some sleep. She closed the door softly behind her, leaving me alone in the quiet darkness. I shed my coat, my shoes, my life, and slid between the cool, clean sheets. I expected to lie awake for hours, my mind replaying the horror of the last 24 hours. But the moment my head hit the pillow, a profound and bottomless exhaustion claimed me. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first I'd had in months, rocked to rest in the cradle of a stranger's kindness. The river could wait. For now, I was safe. And as I drifted off, I couldn't help but wonder about the gruff, silent man who had pulled me back from the brink. Who was Silas? And why had he saved a woman who had given up on saving herself? The answer, I would soon learn, was far more complex and heartbreaking than I ever could have imagined. The sun was already streaming through the lace curtains when I awoke, casting dancing patterns on the wooden floor. For a fleeting, blissful moment, I didn't know where I was. There was no heavy presence of Dwayne beside me, no familiar scent of his cologne, no dread of the silence that would greet me when I went downstairs. There was only the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee and the distant sound of a gospel hymn being hummed. Then memory came crashing back in, a tidal wave of pain and humiliation. The bridge, the cold, Dwayne's face twisted in disgust, Tiffany's smug smile. I curled into a ball under the quilt, wanting to disappear, to slide back into the merciful oblivion of sleep. But the smell of the coffee was too insistent, too promising. It was a smell that belonged to a world where life went on, where people still got up and made breakfast, a world I was no longer sure I belonged to. With a groan, I forced myself out of the warm bed. I found my flimsy duffel bag at the foot of the bed, where Silas must have left it after bringing it in from the truck. I pulled out a change of clothes, wrinkled sweats and a faded t-shirt, and splashed cold water on my face in the small adjoining bathroom. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Her eyes were puffy and bloodshot, her face pale and drawn. She looked defeated. I turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Downstairs, Miss Hetty was in the kitchen, a cheerful, bustling presence in a brightly colored apron. The table was set for 3. "Morning, sugar," she said with a warm smile. "I was just about to call you. Hope you like your eggs scrambled." I mumbled a good morning, feeling awkward and out of place. I was an intruder in this peaceful domestic scene, a dark cloud in their sunny morning. Silas was already at the table, nursing a mug of black coffee and reading a well-worn copy of the Farmer's Almanac. He grunted a greeting without looking up. We ate in a comfortable silence, broken only by Miss Hetty's gentle humming. The food was simple but delicious: scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, grits, and fluffy homemade biscuits with fresh butter and jam. It was soul food in the truest sense of the word, and with every bite I felt a tiny piece of the ice around my heart begin to melt. After breakfast, Miss Hetty shooed me out onto the wide wraparound porch with a fresh cup of coffee. "You go on and get some air," she insisted. "Silas will be out in a minute. I've got things to do in here." The morning was cool but bright, the sky a vast, unbroken expanse of blue. The farm was quiet, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a world away from the noise and chaos of Memphis, a world away from the life that had tried to crush me. I sat on a weathered wooden swing, the chains creaking rhythmically as I gently pushed off with my feet. The knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen its grip just a little. The sheer, relentless peace of the place was a powerful medicine. After a few minutes, the screen door squeaked open and Silas stepped out onto the porch. He held his own mug of coffee and leaned against one of the porch railings, staring out at the fields that stretched away to the horizon. They were fallow now, resting under a blanket of winter wheat. "You feeling any less like jumping today?" he asked, his voice still that low, gravelly rumble. The bluntness of the question startled me, but there was no malice in it, only a straightforward, almost clinical curiosity. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on my own hands, wrapped around the warm mug. "I don't know what I'm feeling," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Good," he grunted. "Not knowing is better than knowing for sure you want to die." We sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a companionable one, the kind that can only exist between two people who have seen the dark underbelly of life and have no need for polite, meaningless chatter. What could he possibly see in a broken woman like me? I was a project, a stray he'd brought home out of some fleeting sense of pity. The thought stung, bringing a fresh wave of shame. He was a good man, him and his sister, but I couldn't be their burden. It was time to figure out what came next, even if every option felt like staring into another abyss. I need to call my daughter, I said finally, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. She'll be worried. It was a lie. My daughter was probably still asleep, oblivious to the fact that her mother had almost ceased to exist last night, but it was the proper thing to say. The excuse a normal person would give. Silas just nodded. Phone's in the kitchen. Hetty will show you. He didn't seem to believe me any more than I believe myself. I went back inside and found Miss Hetty kneading dough on a floured countertop, her movement strong and sure. She pointed me to an old rotary-style phone on the wall. My hands trembled as I dialed the number, my heart pounding with a familiar mix of hope and dread. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Sarah. Leave a message. Her voice was bright, cheerful, and utterly oblivious. Sarah, honey, it's Mom. I began, my own voice cracking. I just wanted to let you know I'm okay. I'm staying with some friends for a little while. I'll call you later. I hung up before I could break down completely. She wouldn't even listen to the message for hours, maybe not until tomorrow. The chasm between my reality and hers had never felt so vast. I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder and turned to see Miss Hetty looking at me, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. Children get caught up in their own lives, she said softly. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they forget we're still living ours. She wiped her floury hands on her apron. Now, why don't you tell me what happened? Sometimes saying it out loud takes away some of its power. And so, sitting there in that warm, cinnamon-scented kitchen, I told her everything. The words poured out of me in a torrent of pain and humiliation. I told her about Dwayne and Tiffany, about the years of quiet neglect that had escalated into open contempt. I told her about the name he had called me. The final, crushing blow to a spirit that was already bruised and battered. She listened without interruption, her hands busy with her dough, but her attention focused entirely on me. She nodded in all the right places, her expression a mixture of righteous anger on my behalf and profound empathy for my pain. When I was done, my voice raw and my eyes wet, she wiped her hands again and pulled me into a fierce, enveloping hug. I buried my face in her shoulder and sobbed, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. It was the kind of cry I hadn't allowed myself in years, a release of all the pent-up grief, anger, and despair. She just held me, patting my back and murmuring soothing words until the storm finally passed. There now, she said, pulling back and handing me a handkerchief. You let it all out. That's good. She looked me straight in the eye, her own gaze fierce and unwavering. That man is a fool, Celeste. A blind, pathetic fool. He threw away a diamond because he was too stupid to see its worth. Her words, so simple and so certain, were like a lifeline. In that moment, she gave me back a piece of myself I thought was gone forever. The belief that I was, in fact, worth something. That I wasn't the useless, discarded thing Dwayne had made me feel I was. It was a tiny flicker of light in a vast darkness, but it was enough. It was a start. But as I sat there, absorbing her strength, a question nagged at the back of my mind. Why were they being so kind to a complete stranger? What was in it for them? There was a story here, a reason for Silas's late-night drives and his sister's boundless compassion. I had a feeling their own lives were touched by a sorrow just as deep as my own, and that our paths had crossed for a reason I was not yet meant to understand. Their kindness was a mystery, and it was one I felt compelled to solve. Later that afternoon, after I had regained some semblance of composure, Miss Hetty put me to work. "Can't have you sitting around moping," she declared. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop." She tasked me with peeling apples for a pie, a simple repetitive task that was surprisingly therapeutic. The rhythmic scrape of the peeler, the crisp scent of the apples, the quiet industry of the kitchen, it all served to ground me, to pull me out of the swirling vortex of my own thoughts and into the present moment. Silas came in from whatever work he'd been doing outside, his boots caked with mud. He washed his hands at the sink and grabbed one of the peeled apple slices, crunching on it loudly. "You're still here," he observed, his tone neutral. "For now," I replied, not meeting his eyes. "Good," he said, and that was all. But there was a weight to that single word, a sense of approval that was both surprising and strangely validating. He pulled up a chair at the table and began cleaning his fingernails with a small pocket knife, a ritual that seemed both meticulous and deeply ingrained. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He was a man of few words, but his presence filled the room. There was a stillness about him, a self-contained strength that was a stark contrast to Dwayne's loud, blustering insecurity. Dwayne had always needed to be the center of attention, to have his ego stroked, his presence acknowledged. Silas seemed to exist entirely on his own terms, indifferent to the opinions of others. He was a puzzle, a man wrapped in layers of gruff silence. As I finished with the apples and started slicing them into a large bowl, a sudden, racking cough seized him. It was a deep, ugly sound that seemed to tear up from his very soul. He doubled over, his body shaking with the force of it. Miss Hetty rushed to his side, a glass of water in her hand, her face a mask of worry. He waved her away, struggling to catch his breath. When the fit finally subsided, he was pale and trembling, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. He took a long, ragged breath and straightened up, avoiding both my and his sister's concerned gazes. "Just a tickle in my throat," he rasped, his voice strained. But I saw the look that passed between him and Hetty. It was a look of shared sorrow, of a burden carried together for a long, long time, and in that moment, I knew. I knew that the shadow of death that had followed me to the bridge also lived in this house. It was a different kind of shadow, one being fought with a quiet, stubborn dignity, but it was there all the same. The mystery of Silas was beginning to unravel, and the truth, I suspected, was going to be both devastating and profound. The coughing fit passed, but it left a heavy silence in its wake. The comfortable atmosphere in the kitchen had evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension. Miss Hetty busied herself at the stove, her back to us, but the rigid set of her shoulders spoke volumes. Silas sat at the table, his breathing still shallow, staring at the scarred wooden surface, as if the answers to the universe were carved into its grain. He refused to look at me, but I could feel the weight of his unspoken reality. He knew that I had seen, that I had understood something had shifted. The veil of gruff invincibility had slipped, revealing a glimpse of the fragile man beneath. I didn't know what to say. "Are you all right?" felt like a stupid, hollow question. Of course he wasn't all right. That cough hadn't been a simple tickle. It was the sound of a body at war with itself. I quietly finished slicing the apples. The rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board, the only sound. The pie suddenly felt frivolous, an absurdly domestic activity in the face of such a profound, unspoken crisis. Finally, Silas pushed his chair back, the scraping sound loud in the quiet room. "Walk with me," he said, his voice still raspy. It wasn't a request. It was the same quiet command he had used on the bridge. He grabbed his denim jacket from a peg by the door and walked outside without waiting to see if I would follow. Miss Hetty turned from the stove, her eyes pleading with me. "Go on," she whispered. He needs to talk. And he won't talk to me." I dried my hands on a dish towel and followed him out into the crisp afternoon air. He was already halfway to the barn, his stride slow but steady. I had to hurry to catch up. He didn't speak until we reached a weathered fence that bordered a vast, empty field. He leaned his forearms on the top rail, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. I stood beside him, a silent apprentice in the art of quiet contemplation. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the earthy smell of the delta. "I've got cancer," he said, the words stark and unadorned, dropped into the peaceful afternoon like stones into a still pond. Lungs. The doctors gave me 6 months. That was a year ago. He said it with no self-pity, no drama. It was a statement of fact, like telling me the sky was blue or the dirt was brown. He finally turned his head and looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face. "I'm not telling you this for your pity," he said, his voice hard. "I'm telling you this because I saw you on that bridge last night, ready to throw away a life that you could have for another 30, maybe 40 years, and it made me angry." The confession hung in the air between us. His anger wasn't directed at me, not really. It was directed at the cosmic unfairness of it all, the bitter irony. "I get up every morning and I fight," he continued, his voice low and intense. "I fight to breathe. I fight to walk out to this barn. I fight to eat the food my sister makes me, even when it tastes like ash in my mouth. I am fighting tooth and nail for every single sunrise I have left. And you were about to give all of yours away because some fool of a man hurt your pride." His words were like a slap in the face, brutal in their honesty, but they weren't cruel. They were a raw, unfiltered dose of a perspective I had completely lost. My own sorrow, which had felt so monumental, so all-consuming, suddenly seemed small, self-indulgent. My pain was real, yes. The betrayal, the humiliation, they were deep, gaping wounds. But they weren't fatal. Not like this. Not like the insidious thief that was stealing the very breath from this man's lungs. I was so focused on the life that had ended that I had forgotten I still had a life to live. How could I have been so blind? This stoic, harsh man was showing me a courage I couldn't have fathomed just 24 hours ago. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words inadequate. "Not for me," he grunted, turning back to look at the field. "Be sorry for yourself. Sorry you let a man like that convince you that his opinion of you was the truth." He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he shook one out. It seemed like the height of irony, a man with lung cancer smoking a cigarette, but I said nothing. It was his fight, his rules. He lit it, took a long, slow drag, and exhaled a plume of smoke that was snatched away by the wind. "Hetty hates it when I do this," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Says it's like inviting the devil in for supper when he's already sitting at the head of the table." He took another drag. "The thing is," he said, his voice taking on a different tone, more thoughtful, "this business, Hetty and me, we built it from nothing. Just a couple of roadside gas stations, nothing fancy, but they're ours. They've kept a roof over our heads and food on our table for 40 years. He fell silent for a moment, lost in thought. "Problem is, I'm too weak to run things proper anymore. I've got this manager, a fella named Ray, who's been with me for years. But the numbers, they're not adding up. I think he's stealing from me, skimming off the top. But I don't have the energy to prove it. I can't spend my last days chasing a thief." He flicked the ash from his cigarette and looked at me again, his gaze sharp and appraising. "Hetty told me you went to college. Said you studied business, accounting, something like that before you married that fool?" I nodded, surprised she had shared that. It was a part of my life I hadn't thought about in decades. A lifetime ago, before I became just Dwayne's wife, I had been a top student. I'd had ambitions, dreams. They were like old photographs, faded and forgotten in a dusty attic. "I need help, Celeste," he said, using my name for the first time. "I need someone with a sharp mind to go through my books. Someone I can trust. I can't trust Ray anymore, and Hetty, her heart's in the right place, but she gets flustered by the numbers." He took one last drag from the cigarette and dropped it to the ground, crushing it under the heel of his boot. "I saved your life last night," he said, his voice devoid of any arrogance. It was again a simple statement of fact. "Now, I'm asking you to help me with mine. What's left of it anyway?" The proposition was stunning. It was absurd. Me, a woman who just last night had been a crumpled heap of despair ready to end it all. He wanted me to save his business, to uncover a fraud. I hadn't balanced a checkbook in years, let alone analyzed a company's financial records. The very idea was terrifying. But it was also electrifying. It was a purpose, a lifeline, a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with Dwayne or the life he had destroyed. It was a chance to be someone other than a victim. It was a path forward, away from the bridge, away from the river, away from the empty house, and the triumphant smirk of a younger woman. It was a challenge, laid at my feet by a dying man who had more fight in his little finger than I'd had in my whole body. I looked from his tired, determined face to the vast, open fields, to the big, endless sky. A choice. For the first time in a long time, I had a real choice. I could slide back into the comfortable misery of my grief, or I could take this man's hand and step into a world I didn't know, a future I couldn't predict. The woman from last night would have refused. But the woman standing here now, in the light of this new, terrifying knowledge, she was different. Something inside me had already started to shift. "Okay, Silas," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than it had been in years. "I'll do it." The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally different. The air in the farmhouse still smelled of coffee and bacon, but now it was mingled with something else, the scent of purpose. After a breakfast eaten in a now familiar, comfortable silence, Silas led me not to the porch, but to a small, dusty room off the main hallway that served as his office. It was a masculine space, cluttered but organized in its own way, smelling of old paper, leather, and the faint, lingering scent of the cigarettes he smoked in secret. In the center of the room, on a large, scarred oak desk, sat a mountain. It was a mountain of paper, ledger books, shoe boxes overflowing with receipts, stacks of invoices held together by decaying rubber bands, and bank statements dating back years. It was the physical manifestation of a business run on handshakes and gut feelings, a system built on a trust that Silas now believed had been betrayed. He gestured to the chaotic pile with a sweep of his hand. "It's all there," he said, his voice a low rumble. 40 years of my life. See if you can make any sense of it." For a long moment, I just stared at the paper mountain, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washing over me. What had I done? What had I agreed to? The woman who had once graduated with honors in business administration was a ghost, a distant memory. The woman standing here now was Celeste, who for the past 30 years had managed nothing more complex than a household budget, and lately, not even that. My mind, once sharp and analytical, felt like a rusty engine, seized up from decades of disuse. Doubt was a cold, creeping vine wrapping itself around my newfound resolve. I couldn't do this. It was too much. I was a fraud, and it was only a matter of time before Silas realized his mistake. He must have seen the fear in my eyes. He reached out and placed a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. His grip was surprisingly gentle. "Just start with one box," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "That's all. Just one." He left me then, closing the door softly behind him, granting me the privacy to either succeed or fail on my own terms. I stood frozen for another minute, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic pounding of my heart. Just one box. The instruction was so simple, so manageable. It cut through the overwhelming fog of my anxiety. I took a deep breath, the dusty air filling my lungs, and walked over to the desk. I picked up a shoebox at random. It was filled with gasoline purchase receipts and handwritten logs of daily sales from one of the stations. The ink was faded, the paper brittle with age. My hands trembled as I took out the first receipt. It was dated 5 years ago. The numbers were just numbers, meaningless symbols on a piece of paper. My brain refused to engage. I felt the familiar sting of tears welling up, and I squeezed my eyes shut. Number. You will not cry. You will not fall apart. I thought of Dwayne's sneering face. He said my brain was as fat as my body. The memory, so painful just days ago, now sparked something else. A hot, sharp flicker of anger. Anger was a fuel I hadn't used in a long time. It burned away the tears and cleared my head. I opened my eyes, my gaze hardening with a resolve I didn't know I possessed. I would not be that woman. I would not be the victim on the bridge. I was Celeste, and I was going to figure this out. I pulled a yellow legal pad and a pen from a dusty drawer and began to work. Slowly, painstakingly, I started to create a system. I designated corners of the large desk for different years, different stations, different types of expenses. I uncapped a collection of dried-out highlighters, coaxing them back to life, and began color coding. Green for fuel purchases, yellow for payroll, pink for repairs, and maintenance. The first few hours were agonizingly slow. My mind fought me every step of the way, resisting the discipline of numbers and logic, but I persisted. Just one box, then another, then a ledger book. I lost track of time, consumed by the simple, methodical task of bringing order to chaos. It was a strange kind of therapy. While my hands sorted through the tangible remnants of Silas's life, my mind began to sort through the wreckage of my own. Each receipt I categorized, each column of numbers I added, felt like a small act of rebellion against the helplessness that had consumed me. By lunchtime, I hadn't found a smoking gun, but I had found whispers, small things, inconsistencies that pricked at the edges of my awareness. There was a receipt for a major engine repair on a delivery truck, but the date on the receipt was a Sunday, and the garage it was from was, according to a quick search on the office's ancient desktop computer, closed on Sundays. There was a pattern of cash deposits that were always slightly, almost imperceptibly, lower on the days Ray, the manager, was scheduled to close. And there were the supply invoices. So many invoices for motor oil, for antifreeze, for cases of soda and snacks, far more than stations of their size could possibly sell. Was Ray padding the orders and selling the excess for cash? Or was he simply a terrible inventory manager? It was too soon to tell. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet, but it was a thread, and I felt a long-forgotten thrill, the intellectual excitement of a puzzle beginning to take shape. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to my life. I was acting. I was hunting. When Miss Hetty knocked on the door and told me lunch was ready, I was so engrossed I barely heard her. I looked up, blinking, feeling as if I were emerging from a deep trance. The sun had moved across the sky and my back ached from leaning over the desk, but I wasn't tired. I felt alive. At the lunch table, Silas didn't ask how it was going. He just watched me, a knowing look in his dark eyes. He saw the change in me, the spark of focus, the return of a light that had long been extinguished. And in his quiet, affirming gaze, I felt a surge of gratitude so profound it almost brought me to my knees. This gruff, dying man hadn't just saved my life. He was giving me one, and I would not let him down. The whispers in the paperwork were getting louder, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was on the verge of uncovering a story of betrayal that would rock this quiet farm to its very foundations. 2 days turned into a week. The small office became my world. I rose before the sun, my mind already churning with figures and possibilities, and I worked late into the night, fueled by Miss Hetty's strong coffee and my own rekindled determination. The mountain of paper on the desk slowly transformed into neat labeled stacks. The chaos was yielding to order, and within that order, a story of deceit was beginning to write itself. The whispers had grown into a steady, damning chorus. The pattern was undeniable. Inflated invoices from a cousin's supply company, phantom repair bills, and a consistent, methodical skimming of cash from the daily deposits. The manager, Ray, wasn't just an opportunist, he was a predator, slowly bleeding his employer dry, confident in the belief that the old man was too sick and too tired to notice. I had built a fortress of data, a meticulous case file of spreadsheets and cross-referenced receipts that laid the betrayal bare. I felt the ghost of the sharp, confident woman I used to be solidifying within me, her voice growing stronger in my mind. She was demanding action. Silas had been right. It was time. "He's coming by this morning," Silas announced over breakfast on Friday. "Ray comes by every Friday to drop off the weekly reports and pick up the payroll checks." My stomach did a nervous flip. It was one thing to fight a man on paper, to track his misdeeds through a trail of numbers. It was another thing entirely to face him. "I'll be in the barn," Silas continued, his gaze steady on mine. "You'll handle it. It's your show now." The faith he placed in me was both terrifying and exhilarating. He wasn't just letting me find the evidence. He was empowering me to act on it. He was giving me back my voice. I spent the next hour in the office, my hands trembling slightly as I arranged my files on the desk. This wasn't just about Silas's money anymore. This was a test. This was my chance to prove to myself more than anyone that I was not the weak, defeated woman who had stood on that bridge. A little after 10, a shiny, late-model SUV, far too expensive for a gas station manager's salary, crunched up the gravel driveway. A man got out. He was in his late 40s, with a fleshy, overconfident face and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He wore a golf shirt and pleated slacks, looking more like a suburban dad on his day off than a man who worked with his hands. This was Ray. He strode onto the porch and walked into the house without knocking, his voice booming through the quiet rooms. "Hetty, you got coffee for your favorite manager?" He oozed a false, familiar charm that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Silas in his office?" Miss Hetty's voice was tight. "He's out." "But someone is in there waiting for you." Ray's jovial expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He walked to the office and stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over me, then over the neatly organized desk. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then annoyance. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I met his gaze directly. I would not let him see my fear. "My name is Celeste," I said, my voice commendably steady. "I'm Mr. Silas's new financial consultant." His eyes narrowed. He looked me up and down, taking in my simple clothes, my age, my race, and dismissed me in an instant. The smirk returned to his face. "Financial consultant? Is that what we're calling the new cleaning lady?" The insult was designed to throw me off balance, to put me in my place. A week ago, it would have shattered me. But today, it was like a match thrown on dry tinder. The anger, cold and sharp, rose within me. It wasn't the hysterical rage Dwayne used to provoke, but a focused, controlled fury. "I've been reviewing the books, Mr. Johnson," I said, my voice as cold as his eyes, "and I have some questions for you." I tapped a neatly organized stack of papers on the desk. "Let's start with the invoices from Delta Auto Supplies." His face paled slightly, the smirk tightening at the edges. "What about them?" "Well," I said, picking up the top invoice, "I find it curious that we're paying nearly 40% above market rate for motor oil. I also find it curious that the owner of Delta Auto Supplies happens to share your wife's maiden name. A coincidence, I'm sure." I watched him, my gaze unwavering. It was a bluff. I didn't know for sure it was a relative, but it was an educated guess, a shot in the dark aimed right at his guilty conscience. The flicker of panic in his eyes told me I'd hit the target. He sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "Now listen here, you have no right—" "I have every right," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "I work for Silas now, which means you work for me, and I'm telling you that these numbers don't add up." I pushed a spreadsheet across the desk towards him. "This is a summary of the cash shortages from Station 2 over the last 6 months. The interesting thing about this summary is that the shortages only occur on Tuesdays and Fridays. Your shifts, Mr. Johnson." Another coincidence, I'm sure. He stared at the paper, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his scheme. The thought of being exposed, especially by me, an older black woman he had written off as insignificant, was clearly more than his fragile ego could handle. He was like a cornered rat, his bravado stripped away to reveal the pathetic, greedy little man underneath. "You can't prove anything," he snarled, his voice low and threatening. "This is just a bunch of numbers you made up." "Oh, I can prove it," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Every fake invoice, every padded expense report, every single dollar you've stolen from a sick man who trusted you. It's all here. And it's all going to the police. Unless you and I can come to a different arrangement." The air in the small office crackled with tension. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, so suddenly, that it was almost dizzying. He had walked in here the master of his small, corrupt universe, and now he was facing its complete destruction. I didn't know what my next move was, but I knew one thing for certain. The woman who had wanted to disappear from the world was gone. In her place was a woman who was ready to fight. And from the look on Ray's face, he was just beginning to understand how badly he had underestimated his opponent. Ray stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a riverbank. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, mottled gray. His carefully constructed world of petty theft and arrogant impunity was crumbling, and the architect of his destruction was the last person he ever would have suspected. He had walked into this house expecting coffee and a paycheck, not a meticulous, systematic dismantling of his entire life. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to show any of the nervous energy that was thrumming just beneath my skin. I had no real power, not yet. I had no legal standing, no authority to fire him or press charges. All I had was the truth, laid out in neat columns and highlighted receipts. But in that moment, the truth felt like a weapon, and I was wielding it with a skill I thought I had lost forever. "An arrangement?" he finally croaked, his voice a pathetic imitation of its earlier boom. "What kind of arrangement?" "It's very simple," I said, leaning back in Silas's creaky office chair, feeling a surge of confidence that was as intoxicating as it was unfamiliar. "You are going to walk out of this office, drive to the bank, and withdraw every single penny you have stolen. I have a very conservative estimate right here." I pushed another piece of paper across the desk. It was a single number, a figure I had spent 2 sleepless nights calculating. It was high enough to be painful, but low enough that I suspected he could pay it without having to sell his precious SUV. "You will bring that money back here in cash. You will sign a full confession, which I have already taken the liberty of typing up for you, and then you will disappear. You will not contact Silas or Miss Hetty. You will not set foot on the property of any of their gas stations. You will, for all intents and purposes, cease to exist in their world." He looked at the number, then back at me, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Or what? You'll go to the cops? It's my word against yours. I'll say you're some crazy old woman the boss brought in who has a grudge against me. Who are they going to believe?" It was a valid question, one I had asked myself 100 times. But I had an answer. I reached into a drawer and pulled out a small digital voice recorder, placing it on the desk between us. The small red light was blinking. "They'll believe this," I said calmly. "It's a recording of our entire conversation, including the part where you didn't deny any of it. And they'll believe the sworn affidavit from the owner of the garage you supposedly used for all those Sunday repairs." He was quite unhappy to learn his company's name was being used on fraudulent invoices. He's very eager to speak with the authorities. The last bit was a complete fabrication. I hadn't spoken to any garage owner. But the look of absolute terror that washed over Ray's face told me I didn't need to. My web of truth was woven with just enough threads of fiction to be utterly convincing. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. The fight went out of him then, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The cornered rat had given up. "How?" he whispered, the question not directed at me but at the universe. "How did you—" I didn't offer an answer. I didn't need to. He wouldn't have understood it anyway. He couldn't comprehend that the woman he had dismissed as a nobody had a mind that could cut through his lies like a surgeon's scalpel. He couldn't understand that he wasn't just dealing with a cleaning lady. He was dealing with a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He was dealing with Celeste. An hour later, he returned. His face was grim, his movement stiff. He placed a thick manila envelope full of cash on the desk without a word. I counted it quickly, my fingers surprisingly steady. It was all there. I then pushed the typed confession and a pen towards him. He read it, his lips moving silently, and signed his name at the bottom with a jerky, angry motion. I took the paper, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. "It was a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Johnson," I said, the words tasting like sweet, long overdue victory. He just glared at me, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. He turned without a word and walked out of the office, out of the house, and out of our lives. I listened to the sound of his SUV's engine starting, the crunch of the gravel as he sped away, and then silence. I sat there in the quiet office, the envelope of cash on the desk in front of me, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of the confrontation. I had done it. I had actually done it. I had faced down a thief and a bully, and I had won. A slow smile spread across my face. It felt strange, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. A moment later, Silas appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He had a small, satisfied smile on his own face. "I was in the barn," he said, his eyes twinkling, "but the window was open." Heard the whole thing. He walked over to the desk and looked down at the envelope. He didn't touch it. "That garage owner story," he said, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "That was a nice touch." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. I may have embellished a little. "A little?" He laughed, a full, genuine laugh this time. "You bluffed that man with a handful of nothing and he folded like a cheap suit. I haven't seen anything like it since my army poker games." He looked at me then, his expression turning serious. The humor was gone, replaced by a deep, profound respect. "I knew you had it in you, Celeste," he said softly. "I knew it the moment I saw you on that bridge. You weren't weak. You were just a fighter who had forgotten how to fight." He picked up the envelope and handed it to me. "This is yours," he said, "a finder's fee." I stared at him, stunned. "Silas, I can't take this." "You can, and you will," he insisted. "You earned it. More than that, you saved my legacy. You can't put a price on that." He put his hand on my shoulder again, the same gesture he'd used to comfort me when I was terrified of this very room. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice full of a conviction that left no room for doubt. "We've cut out the cancer. Now, it's time to rebuild." In that moment, standing in that dusty little office, I felt a sense of belonging, of worth, that I hadn't felt in 30 years. I wasn't just a guest here anymore. I was a partner. I had a purpose. And as I looked at the determined, dying man in front of me, I knew that our work together was far from over. The departure of Ray left a vacuum, not just in the management of the gas stations, but in the rhythm of our days. The immediate crisis was over, the dragon slain. But now came the harder part. Cleaning up the mess and figuring out what came next. The money I had recovered from Ray was a temporary patch, but the business itself was wounded. It had been neglected, its resources siphoned off, its potential left to wither. Silas, though buoyed by the victory, was still a sick man. His energy came in short, unpredictable bursts, and the confrontation, even though he was only a spectator, had taken its toll. He spent most of the next few days resting, leaving me with the neatly organized files and a profound sense of responsibility. I knew what had to be done. The business couldn't run itself. It needed a leader, someone to oversee the daily operations, manage the employees, and make the strategic decisions that had been ignored for so long. And as I sat in the office, staring at the flow charts and profit and loss statements I had created, I realized with a jolt of both fear and excitement that the only logical person for the job was me. The idea was preposterous. A week ago, my biggest decision had been whether to get out of bed. Now I was contemplating running a business, but the thought, as terrifying as it was, refused to be dismissed. It had taken root in the fertile ground of my newfound confidence, and it was growing with a stubborn, surprising strength. I had the skills. My business degree wasn't just a piece of paper in a forgotten box, it was a foundation. And the knowledge was slowly coming back to me like a half-remembered language. More importantly, I had the motivation. I owed Silas. I owed him my life. And the only way I could repay that debt was to protect the one thing he had left in this world to care about, his legacy. I decided to start by visiting the gas stations myself. I needed to see them, to understand the reality behind the numbers on the page. I needed to meet the employees who weren't thieves, the men and women who depended on this business for their livelihood. Miss Hetty insisted on driving me. Silas's old pickup truck was a temperamental beast, and she didn't trust me with it. Besides, she said with a wink, it's about time I got out of the house and saw what all the fuss was about. There were 3 stations in total, scattered across a 30-mile radius of small delta towns. They were old, a little run down, but they were clean and well located. They were community hubs, places where people didn't just buy gas, but also caught up on local gossip and grabbed a hot coffee on their way to work. At each station, I introduced myself simply as Celeste, a friend of Silas's who's helping out. I didn't mention Ray. I didn't announce myself as the new boss. I just watched, listened, and learned. I spoke with the cashiers and the mechanics, asking them about their jobs, about the customers, about the problems they faced. At first, they were wary. They had been loyal to Silas, but Ray had been their direct supervisor for years. They didn't know who I was or what I wanted, but as the day wore on, their suspicion began to melt away. They saw that I was genuinely interested, that I was listening to their concerns about broken equipment and unreliable suppliers. They saw that I wasn't there to dictate, but to understand. By the end of the day, I had a clear picture of the business, its strengths and its weaknesses. It had good bones, a loyal customer base, and dedicated employees. It just needed direction. It needed care. It needed someone to fight for it. That evening, I found Silas on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the mild evening air, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He looked tired, the lines on his face etched deeper than usual, but his eyes were clear and focused. I pulled up a rocking chair and sat beside him. I went to the stations today, I said softly. He nodded. Hetty told me. They're good places, Silas, I continued. Good people, but they've been adrift. Ray wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing their morale. I took a deep breath, my heart starting to pound again, not with fear this time, but with the courage of my convictions. I want to run them for you, I said, the words coming out in a rush. I want to take over. I can do this. I know I can. I can turn this business around, make it profitable, make it something you can be proud of. I laid out my plan for him, speaking with a clarity and passion I didn't know I possessed. I talked about renegotiating with suppliers, about investing in new equipment, about starting a customer loyalty program. I talked about turning the stations not just into places to buy gas, but into true community assets. He listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the fading light. When I was finished, a long moment passed. The only sounds were the chirping of the crickets and the gentle creak of our rocking chairs. I held my breath, waiting for his verdict. I had laid my soul bare, offering him the most audacious, improbable version of myself. He could laugh. He could tell me I was crazy. He could tell me to go back to my ledgers and leave the real work to someone else. Finally, he turned his head and looked at me. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a deep, quiet affirmation. It was as if he had been waiting for me to say this, as if he had known all along that this was where our strange journey was heading. "I know you can," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out for yourself." He reached over and patted my hand, his touch warm and steady. "It's yours, Celeste," he said, "the whole damn thing. Run it as you see fit." The simple, unadorned trust in his words was more powerful than any contract, more binding than any legal document. It was a gift, freely given, from one fighter to another. But as the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, plunging the world into the soft gray of twilight, a new, daunting thought entered my mind. Running the business was one thing, but what about the man who had given it to me? His cough was getting worse, his good days fewer and farther between. I had a new purpose, a new fight, but his was coming to an end. How do you build a future when the man who gave it to you doesn't have one? The question hung in the cool night air, a silent, heartbreaking counterpoint to my newfound hope. Our victory had been won, but the war was far from over. And I knew that the greatest challenges, both professional and personal, were still ahead of me. The path forward was clear, but it was also shadowed by a grief I was only just beginning to comprehend. The morning air held a different kind of chill now. It wasn't the biting cold of despair that had met me on the bridge, but the crisp, sharp air of a new season, a new beginning. I stood in front of the mirror in the small guest room, a room that had become my sanctuary, and now served as my boardroom. The woman looking back at me was still recognizably Celeste, but the haunted, defeated look in her eyes had been replaced by a spark of nervous energy, of trepidation mixed with a steely resolve. Miss Hetty had insisted on taking me shopping in the nearby town, a quiet act of female solidarity that was more about arming me for battle than about fashion. We didn't buy much, but what we did was chosen with tactical precision. I was wearing a pair of simple, well-fitting black trousers, a crisp white blouse, and a structured blue blazer that made me feel both professional and protected. My hair, which I'd rebraided myself with a care I hadn't shown it in years, was pulled back neatly. It was armor, and today I was going to war. "You look like a CEO, Miss Hetty said, her voice thick with pride as she handed me a travel mug of coffee. Silas was waiting by the pickup truck. He didn't say much, only gave me a long, appraising look and a slow, single nod of approval that spoke volumes. The drive to the main station, the largest of the three, was quiet. My mind was a whirlwind of plans and counterplans, of SWOT analyses and opening speeches. What if they laughed at me? What if they refused to listen? Who was I to command the respect of these people who had known Silas for years? I was an outsider, a stray he had picked up on the side of the road. The old doubts, those familiar venomous whispers, tried to creep back in, but I pushed them down, silencing them with the memory of Ray's defeated face and the feel of Silas's trust, a tangible weight in my hands. The station was already bustling with the morning rush. Cars cycled through the pumps, and a steady stream of customers went in and out of the convenience store. It was a living, breathing organism, and I was about to perform open-heart surgery on it. I had called ahead yesterday, using the authority in my voice that still surprised me, and asked the on-duty manager to have all available staff gather in the garage bay at 9 a.m. for an important meeting. As I walked from the truck toward the open bay doors, every step felt momentous. This was my bridge, a new one. I wasn't standing on the edge of this one, I was marching across it, heading into a new territory. 6 employees were gathered inside, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, annoyance, and suspicion. They were a cross-section of the Delta. A couple of young men in their early 20s, a middle-aged woman with a weary but kind face who ran the register, and 2 older mechanics in greasy overalls. One of the mechanics, a tall, wiry man with salt and pepper hair and deep-set, intelligent eyes, watched me with a particularly skeptical, unreadable expression. He leaned against a workbench, his arms crossed, his posture radiating a silent challenge. I took a deep breath and stood before them, my hands clasped behind my back to hide their trembling. "Good morning," I began, my voice stronger and clearer than I expected. "My name is Celeste. For those of you I haven't met, I've been working with Silas to get a handle on the business finances for the past couple of weeks." A murmur went through the small group. They all knew Ray was gone, but the rumor mill hadn't yet provided a satisfactory explanation. As some of you may know, Ray Johnson is no longer with the company. I let that sink in for a moment. Due to some financial irregularities, we've discovered his employment has been terminated. I saw a few exchanged glances. They weren't surprised. They had known on some level that Ray was crooked. They just hadn't been in a position to do anything about it. "I know that Silas's health has been a concern for all of us," I continued, my voice softening. "He's a good man who built this business on honesty and hard work. And he has asked me to step in and make sure it continues to run on those same principles." I looked from face to face, trying to make a connection. I'm not here to turn things upside down. I'm here to shore things up. I'm here to fix what's broken, to invest in this business, and to invest in all of you. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. I need your knowledge, your experience, your honesty. The skeptical mechanic pushed himself off the workbench. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl, "we don't know you. Silas is the boss. We work for him." "And I work for him too," I replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "My only goal is to protect his legacy. What's your name?" "Earl," he said, not unfriendly, but not friendly either. "Well, Earl," I said, "I respect your loyalty. That's exactly the kind of thing this business needs. All I'm asking for is a chance to earn yours." I then unrolled a large piece of paper I had been carrying and taped it to the wall. It was a simple list. Things I had noticed during my visits and heard from the employees I'd spoken with. Under the heading Things to Fix, I had written, "New coffee machine for Station 2. Repair pothole at Station 1 entrance. New uniforms. Better lighting in the parking lots. Simple, tangible things." "This is my to-do list for this week," I said. "Because I believe that a business that takes care of the small things is a business that can be trusted with the big things. My door is always open. My phone is always on. You have my word on that." The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The suspicion was still there, but it was now tempered with a reluctant curiosity. I hadn't come in swinging an axe, firing people and making dramatic pronouncements. I had come in talking about coffee machines and potholes. I had come in asking for their help. As the meeting broke up and they slowly dispersed back to their jobs, Earl, the mechanic, lingered for a moment. He walked over to the list, his eyes scanning the items. He tapped a finger on new uniforms. "The winter ones, too?" he asked. "The insulated ones?" "Ray promised us those 3 years ago." "Yes, Earl," I said. "The winter ones, too." He grunted, a non-committal sound, and walked away. It wasn't a declaration of support, but it was a start. It was an opening. As I watched him go, I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. I had to earn their trust, fix a broken business, and care for a dying man. The weight of it all was immense. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt strong enough to carry it. True to my word, I became a whirlwind of focused activity. The list I had taped to the garage wall became my gospel, and I set about fulfilling its prophecies with a zeal that surprised even myself. Before noon on that first day, I had ordered the best commercial coffee machine money could buy for Station 2. I made a call to a local paving company and got a quote to fix not just the pothole at Station 1, but to resurface the entire entrance. By the end of the week, a catalog of work apparel was circulating among the employees, and they were putting in their sizes for new shirts, jackets, and yes, insulated winter coveralls. These weren't grand strategic maneuvers that would revolutionize the company's bottom line. They were small, almost trivial investments, but their impact was immediate and profound. They were promises kept. In a world where the employees had been conditioned to expect nothing but neglect and broken promises from management, these small acts of follow-through were seismic. They sent a clear message. Things were different now. Someone was listening. Someone actually cared. My days were a blur of motion. I split my time between Silas's dusty office, where I continued to streamline the chaotic bookkeeping, and the 3 gas stations, where I made a point of being a visible, active presence. I learned the names of every employee, their spouses, their children. I learned who liked their coffee black and who was a fiend for Miss Hetty's sweet potato pie, which I started bringing with me on my visits. I didn't just sit in the manager's office. I worked the register when the lunch rush hit. I helped restock the coolers. I swept the floors. I wanted them to see that I wasn't above any job, that we were all part of the same team, pulling in the same direction. There was resistance, of course. A couple of the younger employees, friends of Ray's, were sullen and uncooperative, clearly resentful of the new regime. I handled them with a firm but fair hand, making it clear that their attitude was their choice, but their job performance was not. One of them quit. The other, seeing the tide of opinion turning among his co-workers, slowly and grudgingly fell in line. My biggest challenge and my most important potential ally was Earl. He remained a bastion of skepticism. He was polite, professional, and did his job with a meticulous skill that was obvious even to my untrained eye. But he kept his distance, watching me with those intelligent, assessing eyes, reserving his judgment. He was the unofficial leader of the employees, the one they looked to for guidance. If I could win over Earl, I could win over everyone. My opportunity came during my second week. I was at the main station when a frantic customer pulled in, her minivan making a terrible clanking sound, a plume of smoke trailing behind it. She had 2 crying children in the back and was on the verge of tears herself. Earl was on his lunch break, but he came out of the garage wiping his hands on a rag. He took one listen to the engine, asked the woman a few calm questions, and diagnosed the problem in under a minute. A belt had snapped and she'd overheated the engine. "It's gonna be a big job, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Probably take me the rest of the afternoon." "You'll need to call someone to pick you up." The woman's face crumpled. "But my husband is out of town," she wailed. "I have no one to call." "I have to pick up my other daughter from school in an hour." I saw the dilemma. Earl couldn't abandon his other work, and the woman was truly stranded. The old Celeste would have felt a pang of pity and looked away. The new Celeste saw an opportunity. I stepped forward. "Earl," I said, "you focus on her car. Get it running. I'll handle this." Before anyone could object, I was ushering the distraught mother and her 2 children into the cab of Silas's pickup truck. I drove her to her daughter's school, then to her house, promising to call her the second her car was ready. When I got back to the station, Earl was just closing the hood of the minivan. He watched me as I walked up, his expression unreadable. "Didn't have to do that," he said, his voice a low grumble. "You're the boss. You're not a taxi service." "A mother in trouble is everybody's business, Earl," I replied simply. "Besides, she's one of our best customers. Looked up her name in the loyalty system Ray never bothered to use. She buys all her gas here. Now she'll buy it here for life. And she'll tell all her friends at the next PTA meeting about the nice people at Silas's station who helped her out when she was in a jam. That's not just kindness, Earl. That's good business." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect? He grunted. That familiar non-committal sound, but this time it felt different. It felt like an admission. He picked up his toolbox and headed back into the garage. "Coffee machine at Station 2 makes a fine cup," he tossed over his shoulder. "But the decaf tastes burnt." I smiled. It was the longest, most positive sentence he had ever said to me. It was a victory. From that day on, things began to shift. Earl started talking to me not just about burnt decaf, but about the business. He had a wealth of knowledge, a deep understanding of the mechanics, the customers, and the community. He pointed out inefficiencies I had missed, suggested a new supplier for tires that was cheaper and more reliable, and gave me the unvarnished truth about which employees were assets and which were liabilities. He became my trusted lieutenant, my eyes and ears on the ground. The bond between us was forged not in a boardroom, but over a broken-down minivan and a shared understanding that a business is more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people. And as I worked to heal the business, I could feel the broken pieces of my own life beginning to knit themselves back together. I was no longer just Celeste, the discarded wife. I was Celeste, the boss. And I was just getting started. With Earl as a trusted advisor and the general morale of the employees on the rise, I felt confident enough to tackle the next big monster lurking in the financial statements, the fuel supplier. The contract Silas had with Big Rig Oil had always felt wrong to me. We were paying far above the regional average for gasoline, and the delivery terms were ridiculously unfavorable. It was a deal that only made sense if someone was getting a kickback. Now that Ray was gone, it was time to renegotiate. I called the regional office of Big Rig Oil and requested a meeting with our account representative. I was expecting a junior salesman, someone I could easily reason with. That was my first mistake. The man who walked into my office a few days later was not a junior salesman. He was a silver-haired shark in a $1,000 suit. His name was Arthur Thorne, and he exuded an aura of smooth, predatory confidence. He had the kind of handshake that was less a greeting and more a subtle test of strength, and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He sat across the desk from me, his expensive cologne filling the small, dusty office, and sized me up with an amused, dismissive air. "So," he began, his voice a silky baritone, "you're the new woman in charge. Ray mentioned you, said you were helping out." "Ray is no longer with the company," I said, my voice firm. "I am not helping out. I am running this business now. And I've called this meeting because I have some serious concerns about our supply contract." Thorne's smile didn't waver. "Oh?" "I've always had a wonderful relationship with Silas and with Ray. We've been partners for a very long time. A partnership should be mutually beneficial, Mr. Thorne," I countered, pushing a folder across the desk. "This is a comparison of your wholesale prices versus the prices of 3 other regional suppliers. As you can see, you are charging us on average 18 cents more per gallon. For a business of our size, that adds up to tens of thousands of dollars a year. I'd like an explanation." He glanced at the folder but didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he was doing. "We pride ourselves on our premium product and our reliable service," he said smoothly. "You pay for quality, Celeste. Surely you understand that." "I understand the concept of a fair market price," I retorted, my patience already wearing thin. "And this isn't it. This is price gouging, and it ends today. I want a new contract, one that reflects the current market rates. Otherwise, I will be taking our business elsewhere." The amusement finally faded from Thorne's eyes, replaced by a cold, hard glint. The shark was done playing. "That would be unwise," he said, his voice losing its silky edge and taking on a menacing chill. "Big Rig Oil has a very large footprint in this part of the state. Most of the independent distributors are under contract with us. You'll find it very difficult to find another supplier who can meet your needs, especially on short notice." It was a threat delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who was used to getting his way. He was telling me that he held all the cards, that he had a monopoly on our survival. He thought he could bully me, intimidate me into submission, just as he had undoubtedly done with Ray. He was counting on me being weak, inexperienced, and scared. He was wrong. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the desk. All the anger I had felt at Dwayne's betrayal, all the fury at Ray's thievery, all the frustration of my former powerless life, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear defiance. "Are you threatening my business, Mr. Thorne?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I'm simply explaining the realities of the marketplace to you, Celeste. It can be a very unforgiving place for newcomers." "Then let me explain the new reality to you," I said, my voice rising with a strength that came from the very core of my being. "This business is under new management, and the new management does not respond well to threats. We will not be extorted. We will not be bullied, and we will not pay 1 cent more than a fair price. You have until the end of the day to send me a revised contract with competitive pricing. If I don't have it by 5 o'clock, our partnership is terminated." The arrogance in his face curdled into pure, undisguised rage. He was not used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone like me. In his world, women like me were invisible. We were props, not players. The idea that I was not only defying him but dictating terms to him was an insult to his very sense of order. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "You've just made a very serious mistake," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I think I do," I replied, standing to meet his glare. "You're a bully and a thief, just like the man you used to have lunch with. And your time is up." He stared at me for a long, venomous moment, his jaw tight. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard that a dusty picture of Silas's old fishing boat fell off the wall and shattered on the floor. I stood there in the ringing silence, my body trembling with adrenaline. I had done it. I had stood up to the shark and thrown him out of my waters. A surge of triumph washed over me. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a cold knot of fear formed in its place. He had been right about one thing. I had made a powerful enemy. And as I looked at the shattered picture frame on the floor, I had the sinking feeling that the battle was over, but the war was just beginning. I had protected our integrity, but I may have just signed the death warrant for our business. The first sign of trouble came 48 hours later. Our weekly fuel delivery, scheduled for 8 a.m. on Monday, never arrived. I called the Big Rig Oil Dispatch Center, and a bored-sounding clerk informed me that our order had been indefinitely delayed due to unforeseen logistical issues. It was a lie, and we both knew it. This was Thorne's opening salvo. By Tuesday morning, Station 1 was out of regular unleaded. By Wednesday, all 3 stations were running on fumes. The no gas signs, which I'd had Earl dig out of a dusty storage closet, were now hanging on our pumps, a stark, humiliating symbol of our defeat. Customers who had been coming to us for years drove in, saw the signs, and drove away with looks of frustration and disappointment. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. My employees were anxious, their newfound morale evaporating in the face of uncertainty. "What are we going to do, Celeste?" the cashier at Station 3 asked, her voice trembling. "How are we supposed to pay our bills if we have no gas to sell?" The question hung in the air, a burden that was mine and mine alone to bear. I had made the decision. I had picked this fight, and now I was leading them all off a cliff. I spent every waking hour on the phone calling every independent fuel distributor I could find within a 200-mile radius. Thorne hadn't been bluffing. Nearly all of them had exclusive contracts with Big Rig Oil. The few that didn't were either too small to handle our volume or mysteriously doubled their prices the moment they heard our name. Thorne was poisoning the well, making sure that no one would dare come to our aid. By Friday, the stations were ghost towns. The vibrant community hubs I had worked so hard to nurture had fallen silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the empty pump islands. I sat in Silas's office, my head in my hands, a mountain of useless spreadsheets in front of me. I was failing. I had stood up to the bully, but he was winning. He was choking the life out of us, and there was nothing I could do. I felt the old, familiar despair creeping back in, the ghost from the bridge whispering in my ear. "See? You can't do this. You're not a businesswoman. You're a failure. You should have just let the river take you. That evening, I sat on the porch with Silas. I had explained the situation to him, my voice flat and defeated. I had told him I was sorry, that I had overplayed my hand, that my pride had endangered his entire legacy. He listened in his usual silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was weaker than I had ever seen him, his breathing shallow, the blanket around his shoulders seeming to swallow his frail frame. The fight with Thorn had taken a toll on me, but my fight was nothing compared to the one he was waging every single second. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. The silence was heavy with my failure. I expected him to be angry, disappointed. I expected him to tell me he had made a mistake in trusting me. But when he finally spoke, his voice was a soft, raspy whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. When I was a boy, he began, his eyes still on the distant fields, my daddy had a farm right on the river. Every few years, the Mississippi would get angry and swell up, flooding everything. Most folks would panic. They'd pile up sandbags, try to fight the water, try to hold it back. They always lost. The river always won. He coughed, a dry, painful sound that shook his whole body. I moved to help him, but he waved me off, his strength returning in a stubborn trickle. But my daddy, he continued, his breathing evening out, he never fought the river. He knew you couldn't. He'd just watch it. And he'd show me the old channels, the little streams and bayous that were dry most of the year. When the big river flooded, these little channels would fill up. They were the river's old paths, the ones most people had forgotten about. They weren't the fastest or the most direct way to go, but they always got you where you needed to be, safe and sound. He finally turned his head and looked at me, his dark eyes holding a deep, urgent meaning. Thorn. He's the flood, Celeste. You can't fight him head on. You'll lose. You need to stop looking at the main river. You need to find the old channels they forgot about. His words were cryptic, a classic piece of Silas's rural allegorical wisdom. But they resonated deep within me, cutting through the fog of my despair. I had been fighting the battle on Thorn's terms, playing by his rules. I had been trying to find another big river, another major supplier, but Silas was telling me to look for something else, something smaller, something forgotten. I didn't know what it meant yet. I had no idea what an old channel looked like in the context of the modern fuel distribution industry. But as I sat there beside him, the seed of an idea, a wild, improbable, desperate idea, began to take root in my mind. The flood was threatening to drown us, but maybe, just maybe, Silas had given me a map to higher ground. The game wasn't over. It was just time to change the rules. The silence of the gas stations was a living entity. It was a heavy, oppressive blanket that smothered the cheerful ringing of the cash register, the friendly banter between customers and staff, the roar of a well-tuned engine leaving the garage. It was the sound of failure, and it followed me everywhere. It was in the worried, questioning eyes of the employees. I could no longer afford to pay for a full week's work. It was in the sympathetic but pitying glances of the townspeople at the grocery store. It was in the strained quiet of the farmhouse and where Miss Hetty tried to fill the space with cheerful humming and the scent of baking, but the underlying tension was as thick as delta humidity. Most of all, it was in the shallow, rattling breaths that came from Silas's room. His health was declining at a terrifying pace. The stress of the business crisis, the knowledge that his life's work was crumbling, was a poison that his already weakened body could not fight. The doctor had been out twice, his face grim, his words couched in gentle but unmistakable finality. There was nothing more to be done. It was a matter of comfort now, of time, and we were running out of it. My days were a blur of desperate, fruitless activity. I sat in the office until my eyes burned from the screen of the ancient computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard, chasing down phantom leads. I researched obscure energy consortiums, federal small business grants, and antitrust laws, hoping to find some loophole, some weapon to use against Thorn. But he had built his fortress well. The world of fuel distribution was a closed circle, a tight-knit club of good old boys, and the doors were firmly slammed in my face. At night I couldn't sleep. Silas's words echoed in my mind, a frustrating, unsolvable riddle. Find the old channels, the ones they forgot about. I pored over old maps of the county looking for... What? A hidden pipeline? An abandoned oil well in a farmer's field? It was madness. The world had moved on. The old channels were gone, filled in by the relentless march of progress and corporate consolidation. My hope, which had burned so brightly just a few weeks ago, was dwindling to a faint, flickering ember. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest. I had done this. My pride, my defiance, my refusal to bow to Thorn had brought this ruin upon us. I had saved Silas from a petty thief, only to deliver him into the hands of a corporate titan who was crushing him without a second thought. One afternoon I was sitting on the porch, staring blankly at a legal pad filled with dead-end phone numbers, when Earl pulled up in his own battered pickup truck. He hadn't been scheduled to work, and my heart sank. Assuming he was coming to tell me he was quitting, that he'd found a job at a garage that actually had cars to work on. He walked up the steps and sat, not in the rocking chair, but on the top step near my feet, a gesture of quiet solidarity. He held out a greasy paper bag. My wife made too much fried chicken for dinner last night, he said, avoiding my eyes. Figured it shouldn't go to waste. We sat in silence for a while, eating the cold, delicious chicken. It was the first real food I'd had in days. It's not your fault, you know, he said finally, his voice a low rumble. What you did with Thorn, you did the right thing. You stood up for us, for Silas. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you. It's costing Silas his business, Earl, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. And maybe his life. Silas is a fighter, Earl countered, his gaze firm. He's not gone yet. And we ain't beat yet either. The folks who work for you, we talked. We're with you, Celeste. We'll take a pay cut, work part-time, whatever it takes. You just tell us what to do. His words, his simple, unwavering loyalty were both a comfort and a knife to the heart. They believed in me, even as I had lost all faith in myself. Their loyalty deserved a leader, not a broken woman drowning in self-pity. After he left, I went back into the office, my resolve hardened by his kindness. I would not give up. I owed it to Earl, to the other employees, to Miss Hetty. I owed it to Silas. I pushed aside the modern maps and the online databases. If I was going to find an old channel, I needed to look in an old place. I turned my attention to the corner of the office I had ignored, the place where the true relics were kept. A stack of dusty, leather-bound ledger books and boxes of files that predated the computer, that predated Ray, that went back to the very beginning of the business. It was a daunting, almost archaeological task. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. It was a history of the business written in Silas's own neat, precise hand. I opened the first book, from 1978. It was a world of $5 fill-ups and hand-cranked gas pumps. I spent hours turning the fragile pages, losing myself in the history, the names of customers long gone, the steady, rhythmic accounting of a business being built from the ground up. It was beautiful, in its own way, but it wasn't helping. I was about to give up, to concede defeat to the crushing weight of the present, when a single unusual entry from 1982 caught my eye. It was a payment, a large one, not to a major oil company, but to a name I didn't recognize. Monsieur Dubois, independent. And next to it, a notation in Silas's handwriting, Tallahatchie Spur Line. I had no idea what it meant, but it was different. It was a whisper from the past. It was a thread. And in a world of dead ends, a single thread was all I needed. The name M. Dubois and the phrase Tallahatchie Spur Line became my new obsession. They were breadcrumbs, left in a 40-year-old forest, and I followed them with the single-minded focus of a starving woman. The office's slow, dial-up internet connection was useless for this kind of deep dive historical research. I needed records, archives, the kind of information that hadn't yet been digitized. The next morning, I drove to the county seat and ensconced myself in the musty, silent archives of the local library. The librarian, a woman with a kind, scholarly face, became my co-conspirator, intrigued by my strange quest. Together, we unearthed a treasure trove of forgotten history. The Tallahatchie Spur Line I discovered was a short 10-mile stretch of railroad track built in the 1920s to connect a handful of cotton gins and lumber mills to the main Illinois Central Line. It was a relic of a bygone era, made obsolete by the rise of the interstate highway system in the late 1960s. The tracks had been officially decommissioned in 1975, and most people had probably forgotten they even existed. But the official county plat maps showed that the right-of-way, the strip of land the tracks were on, had never been sold off. It still existed. An overgrown, invisible corridor cutting through miles of farmland. Then came the second piece of the puzzle, Monsieur Dubois. After hours of scrolling through microfiche records of old newspapers, I found him. Marcus Dubois was a wildcatter, a small-time oil prospector who had a brief, modest run of success in the early 80s, hitting a pocket of sweet crude on a piece of land he'd leased just north of the county. He was a classic Delta eccentric, a Cajun who had moved up from Louisiana, a gambler who had bet it all on a long shot, and for a little while, won. An article from 1982 described him as a man who trusted oil, not banks, and who preferred to do business with a handshake rather than a contract. And then the final, electrifying connection. A short article from the business section, dated October 1982. The headline read, "Local oil man bypasses highways with iron horse." The article detailed how Marcus Dubois, unable to secure a reliable contract with the major trucking companies, had struck a deal with the railroad to lease the defunct Tallahatchie Spur Line. For a brief period, he had used a single ancient tanker car and a leased engine to transport his crude oil from a makeshift loading platform near his well, down to a siding where it could be sold to local businesses. One of those businesses, the article mentioned, was a small but growing chain of gas stations owned by a young Silas Jones. It all clicked into place. Silas's riddle. The old channels they forgot about. He wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was being literal. Faced with a fuel shortage or a pricing dispute back in the early days, he hadn't fought the big oil companies. He had bypassed them completely, using a forgotten piece of infrastructure to connect with an independent supplier. It was a brilliant, audacious, and utterly unconventional solution. It was a lifeline. My heart pounded with an excitement so intense it felt like I might levitate right out of my library chair. I had found it. I had found the channel. But was it still there? Was Dubois still alive? Could a plan that worked 40 years ago possibly work today? The doubts were there, but they were drowned out by the roar of a single powerful idea. I packed up my research, thanked the librarian who looked as thrilled as I was, and practically ran out of the library. My first stop on the way back to the farm was a small local print shop. I used their computer to do a search for Marcus Dubois. He was a ghost online with no digital footprint to speak of, but I found a property tax record for a small parcel of land in the northern part of the county, the same area where his well had been. The owner was listed as M. Dubois. He was still there. My next stop was the county tax assessor's office. I pulled the records for the Tallahatchie Spur Line right away. It was still a single, unbroken line on the map owned by a holding company that had bought the assets of the defunct railroad decades ago. It was a forgotten, worthless piece of land, a line item on a balance sheet in an office 1,000 miles away. It was perfect. By the time I got back to the farmhouse, the sun was setting, and I was holding a folder thick with maps, property records, and grainy photocopies of old newspaper articles. I felt like a general preparing for battle. Miss Hetty was on the porch, her face etched with worry. Celeste, honey, where have you been? I was about to call the sheriff. I've been in the library, I said, a wide, triumphant smile spreading across my face. And I think I just found a way to save us. I went to Silas's room. He was awake, propped up on his pillows, looking frail and translucent in the fading light. I sat on the edge of his bed and, my voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and reverence, I laid it all out for him. I showed him the maps, the articles, the picture of the young, grinning wildcatter. I explained the Tallahatchie spur line, the independent well, the audacious plan from 4 decades ago. As I spoke, I saw a light return to his eyes, a flicker of the old fierce fire. He had forgotten. The illness, the pain, the years of relying on conventional suppliers had buried the memory deep. But now it was coming back to him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant, lost in the memory of his younger, scrappier self. Marcus Dubois, he whispered, the name a rusty key turning in an ancient lock. He was a crazy Cajun. Honest as the day is long, but crazy. He looked at me then, his eyes sharp and clear. The fog of his illness had momentarily lifted. The channel is still there, he said, his voice a little stronger, but the water might be gone. You'll have to go see for yourself. I'm leaving in the morning, I said, my voice full of a certainty that left no room for doubt. Go on then, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. He reached out a thin, trembling hand and gripped mine. His skin was as dry as parchment, but his grip was surprisingly firm. You go on and open that channel up. It's time the old ways showed the new ways a thing or two. I left his room feeling not like a desperate woman on a fool's errand, but like an emissary, a chosen successor, sent to resurrect a forgotten magic. The plan was insane. It involved a recluse, a ghost of a railroad, and a level of logistical complexity that made my head spin. It was almost certainly doomed to fail, but it was the only hope we had. And for the first time in a long time, it was enough. The address on the tax record led me deep into the rural northern part of the county, a landscape of rolling hills, dense pine forests, and small hardscrabble farms. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a rutted dirt track that seemed more like a suggestion than a road. Silas's old pickup truck rattled and groaned in protest, but I pushed it onward, guided by a hand-drawn map and a stubborn sense of purpose. Finally, I saw it, a rusty faded sign that read Dubois Keep Out. Behind it, a long, overgrown driveway led into the woods. Taking a deep breath, I turned onto the driveway, the branches of untamed trees scraping against the sides of the truck like angry fingernails. The track opened into a clearing, and in the center stood a small, weathered cabin with a plume of smoke curling from its stone chimney. A collection of rusting, skeletal oil equipment, the ghosts of a former boom, littered the yard like ancient metal dinosaurs. And sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, a shotgun laid across his lap, was a man who had to be Marcus Dubois. He was older, his face a road map of wrinkles and his hair a wild shock of white, but his eyes, even from a distance, were sharp and suspicious. He watched me bring the truck to a halt, his posture radiating a profound desire to be left alone. I got out of the truck, my hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Mr. Dubois?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast woody silence. "My name is Celeste Jones. I'm a friend of Silas Jones. I was hoping I could talk to you." The name Silas seemed to register. He didn't lower the shotgun, but his posture relaxed a fraction of an inch. "Silas Jones," he said, his voice a gravelly Cajun drawl I recognized from my imagination. "Haven't heard that name in 30 years. He's still kicking?" "He is," I said, walking slowly toward the porch, "but he's not doing well. That's why I'm here." I spent the next hour on that porch, explaining everything. I told him about Silas's illness, about Big Rig Oil and Arthur Thorne, about the corporate stranglehold that was killing our business. And then I laid out my crazy, impossible plan. I showed him the maps, the right-of-way records, the old newspaper clippings. I asked him if his well was still viable, if the old channel could be opened again. He listened in silence, his sharp eyes never leaving my face. He was reading me, I realized. Not just my words, but my spirit, my intent. When I was done, he just rocked back and forth, the rhythmic creak of the chair the only sound. "The well ain't dry," he said finally, looking out at the rusting pump jack in his yard. "Never was. The price of crude dropped in '86 and the big boys squeezed me out. Wasn't worth the hassle to keep pumping." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "That spur line, ain't nobody used that in 40 years. The tracks are probably rusted through, the cross ties rotted away. It'd be a hell of a job to get it running again." "But is it possible?" I pressed, my heart pounding. He turned his gaze back to me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. The ghost of the young ambitious wildcatter, the gambler who loved a long shot. "Possible," he chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Cher, in this life, anything is possible if you're dumb enough or desperate enough to try. The question is, why should I? I'm an old man. I got enough to see me to the end. This ain't my fight." This was the moment, the crux of the entire plan. It all came down to this. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice quiet but fierce. "Because it's the right thing to do," I said. "Because men like Arthur Thorne think they own the world. They think they can crush little people like us. People who built their lives with their own 2 hands. They think men like you and Silas are just relics, dinosaurs to be cleared out of the way. This isn't just about fuel, Mr. Dubois. It's about respect. It's about showing them that the old ways, the old channels still have power." I let the words hang in the air. I had nothing else to offer him. No money, no guarantees, only an appeal to a shared history and a common enemy. He stared at me for a long, long time, his eyes boring into me. Then a slow, wide grin spread across his wrinkled face, revealing a surprising number of white teeth. He slapped his knee and let out a booming laugh that echoed through the clearing. "Silas Jones," he cackled. "That old son of a gun always knew how to pick 'em. All right, Mrs. Celeste Jones, you got yourself a partner. Let's go give them corporate bastards a Cajun surprise." The rest of the day was a whirlwind. Marcus, he insisted I call him Marcus, was a force of nature, a 75-year-old bundle of wiry energy and surprising technical know-how. He showed me the well, the pumps, the storage tanks that still held a small amount of crude. He declared it all workable with a little Cajun ingenuity. Then we got in his ancient Jeep and drove the entire 10-mile length of the Tallahatchie spur line. It was in better shape than he'd let on. Overgrown, yes, with saplings growing up between the rails, but the track bed was solid, and the rails themselves, though rusted, were largely intact. "We'll need a crew to clear this," he said, his mind already working. "And we'll need an engine and a tanker car." That was my job. While Marcus started making calls to a network of old-timers and roughnecks he knew, I got on the phone. My research had led me to a railway museum in a neighboring state. After being transferred 3 times, I found myself talking to a retired railroad engineer who was the museum's curator. I explained the situation, the desperate David and Goliath nature of our fight. The story resonated with him. He told me they had a fully functional, albeit ancient, switcher engine and a vintage tanker car they use for local parades. For a significant donation to the museum's restoration fund, a donation I promised from our first delivery's profits, he said he might just be able to arrange for a historical reenactment on a decommissioned spur line. By the time I left Marcus's cabin late that evening, the impossible plan was starting to feel possible. We had a supplier. We had a transport route. We had a train. We just needed a crew, a lot of hard work, and a little bit of luck. As I drove back down the dark country roads, I felt a joy so fierce and pure it was almost painful. I wasn't just saving a business anymore. I was part of a conspiracy, a rebellion of old-timers and forgotten ways against a cold, modern world. We were resurrecting a ghost, and we were going to ride it into battle. The next 3 days were a testament to the power of a shared purpose. Our rebellion, as I had started calling it in my head, took shape with a speed and efficiency that was nothing short of miraculous. Marcus Dubois was a general rousing his retired army. He assembled a crew of 6 men, all of them in their 60s and 70s, a retired railroad foreman, a couple of laid-off oil field workers, and 3 farmers whose land bordered the spur line. They were men with calloused hands, deep knowledge of the land and its machinery, and a shared disdain for corporate bullies like Arthur Thorne. They descended on the Tallahatchie spur line with chainsaws, bush hogs, and a collective lifetime of know-how. They worked from sunrise to sunset, fueled by Miss Hetty's endless supply of fried chicken, biscuits, and sweet tea. Earl, taking a leave of absence from the gas station, joined them, his quiet competence and mechanical skills proving invaluable. I became the quartermaster and diplomat, coordinating everything. I finalized the deal with the Railway Museum, arranged for the engine and tanker car to be brought in on a flatbed truck, and secured the necessary permits from a bewildered county clerk who hadn't seen a request for that right-of-way in his entire career. I used a chunk of the money I'd recovered from Ray to pay for it all. A beautiful piece of poetic justice. The business's money, once stolen, was now being used to save it. While the crew cleared the tracks, Marcus and his roughneck friends worked their magic on the old pump jack. With a great groaning and belching of smoke, the ancient machine shuddered back to life, its rhythmic seesawing motion a heartbeat returning to the dormant land. Slowly, thick, dark crude oil began to flow into the holding tanks. It felt like we were witnessing a miracle. The final piece of the puzzle was the refinery. Our crude was no good to us if we couldn't turn it into gasoline. My research had uncovered a small independent refinery 100 miles away. A family-owned operation that was constantly struggling to compete with the giants like Big Rig Oil. I called the owner, a man named Frank Peterson, and laid out the whole crazy story. He was skeptical at first, but the idea of a new, independent source of crude and the chance to stick it to his corporate nemesis was too tempting to resist. He agreed to process our oil if we could get it to him. On the 4th day, everything came together. The spur line was clear, the well was pumping, and the train, a beautiful snub-nosed old switcher engine and a single gleaming black tanker car, sat waiting on the siding where we'd trucked it in, looking like a misplaced museum exhibit. I stood with Marcus, Earl, and the rest of the crew as the tanker car was slowly filled with Marcus's crude oil. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and sweet, earthy petroleum. It was the smell of victory. I drove back to the farmhouse to get Silas. He was having a good day, one of his increasingly rare lucid spells. He was weak, but he was determined. With my help and Miss Hetty's, he got dressed and we half-carried him to the pickup truck. He wanted to see it. He needed to see it. We arrived at the makeshift loading platform just as the old railroad foreman was climbing into the engine's cab. Silas looked at the scene before him, the resurrected pump jack, the cleared tracks, the waiting train, and a slow, deep smile spread across his tired face. It was the smile of a man seeing his own legacy, his own fighting spirit made manifest in the world. "You did it, Celeste," he whispered, his voice full of a quiet, profound awe. "You opened the channel." The train's horn blew, a loud, lonesome sound that echoed through the piney woods. With a hiss of steam and a clank of coupling, the single tanker car began to move. It crawled down the newly cleared tracks, a ghost from the past chugging its way toward the future. It was a ridiculously small, inefficient, and anachronistic operation, but it was ours. The next afternoon, a fuel tanker, not a gleaming big rig oil truck, but one of Frank Peterson's more modest vehicles, pulled into the main gas station. Earl had the honor of filling the station's empty underground tanks. As the first gallons of our own hard-won gasoline gurgled into the reservoir, a cheer went up from the employees who had gathered to watch. I looked across the lot and saw customers, our loyal customers pulling in, their faces breaking into smiles as they saw the now open sign I had just hung. We were back in business. That evening, I sat with Silas on the porch again. He was exhausted but peaceful. He had seen enough. The tanker from the refinery had made its deliveries to the other 2 stations as well. Our pumps were full. Our lights were on. We had won. Thorn will be furious when he hears, I said, a smile in my voice. Let him be, Silas said, his eyes closed. Floods come and go, but the river finds a way. He was right. We had found a way. We hadn't fought the flood. We had bypassed it. We had built our own river. As I sat there, listening to the gentle rhythm of his breathing, I knew this victory was more than just business. It was a reclamation. I had reclaimed my confidence, my purpose, my strength. And I had helped a good man reclaim his legacy, ensuring that the lights of his life's work would continue to burn bright long after he was gone. The future was still uncertain, and my heart ached with the knowledge of the loss that was coming. But for the first time since I'd stood on that bridge, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The success of the Tallahatchie Spur Line was more than just a logistical victory. It was a revolution. News of our scrappy, old-fashioned rebellion against big rig oil spread through the Delta like wildfire. We became local legends. Other independent station owners, long suffering under Thorn's thumb, started calling me, asking for advice. Frank Peterson, the refinery owner, was so pleased with the arrangement that he helped us form a small independent co-op, a network of the forgotten channels all flowing together to create a new, stronger river. Our gas stations weren't just surviving, they were thriving. With the lower fuel costs, I was able to lower our prices, drawing in even more customers. I invested the increased profits back into the business, renovating the storefronts, upgrading the mechanics' equipment, and giving every employee a long overdue raise. I was no longer just a manager. I was an innovator, a leader, a respected businesswoman. I attended town hall meetings, joined the local chamber of commerce, and found that my voice, once a timid whisper, now carried the weight of authority. People listened when I spoke. They sought my opinion. The woman who had been invisible for 30 years was now a pillar of the community. But this brilliant, sunlit world of professional success was shadowed by a deep and profound sorrow that awaited me each evening when I returned to the farmhouse. While my public life was one of triumphant ascent, my private life was a slow, heartbreaking descent into grief. Silas was fading. The brief resurgence of spirit he'd experienced upon our victory had been a final, beautiful flare of a dying fire. Now, the flame was sinking low, the light withdrawing from his eyes. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his bedroom. Some days he was lucid, his mind sharp, his old gruff humor intact. On those days, we would talk for hours. He would tell me stories of his youth, of the business, of the life he and Hetty had shared on this land. I would tell him about the co-op, about the new uniforms, about Earl's latest grumbling complaint that was really a compliment in disguise. On these good days, he was my mentor, my partner, my friend. More frequent, however, were the bad days. The days when he was lost in a fog of pain and medication, when he didn't know who I was, when his breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. On those days, I became his nurse, his caregiver. Alongside Miss Hetty, I learned to administer his medicine, to change his linens, to spoon broth between his pale lips. There was no revulsion in these tasks, only a deep, aching tenderness. This man who had shown me such strength was now completely vulnerable, and the act of caring for him felt like the most sacred duty I had ever undertaken. The three of us, me, Silas, and Hetty, had become a family, forged in the crucible of crisis and now bound together by the intimacy of impending loss. Hetty, who had been a rock of maternal strength, began to lean on me. We would sit together in the kitchen late at night, long after Silas had drifted off into a fitful sleep, and we would talk. We would cry. We would share our fears and our memories. She told me about the boy Silas had been, mischievous and stubborn. I told her about the life I'd had with Dwayne, a story I'd never been able to share with anyone before. In that quiet, cinnamon-scented kitchen, we found a sisterhood that healed parts of me I didn't even know were still broken. He loves you like a daughter, you know, she told me one night, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. You gave him a reason to hold on a little longer. You let him see his life's work was safe. That's the greatest gift you could have given him. The guilt I had once felt over provoking the fight with Thorn had been replaced by a quiet, fierce pride. I had given Silas a good death. I had given him a final victory to carry with him into the great unknown. I was balancing two worlds, living a strange and polarized existence. In one world, I was a CEO, making decisions, signing contracts, and building a future. In the other, I was a daughter, holding the hand of a dying man, whispering words of comfort and preparing for a future without him. The transition between the two was often jarring. I would leave a contentious meeting with a supplier, my mind buzzing with figures and strategy, and arrive at the farmhouse to find that Silas had had a bad turn, his breathing weaker, his presence in the world more tenuous. The contrast was a constant, painful reminder of the fragility of life, of the way triumph and tragedy are always, inextricably, intertwined. I was living the best days of my new life and the worst days of our shared one, all at the same time. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones, that this delicate, painful, beautiful balance could not hold for much longer. The end was coming, and with it, a final, unexpected proposition that would change the course of my life once more. One evening, after a particularly difficult day when Silas had been almost completely unresponsive, he had a sudden, startling return to clarity. I was sitting by his bedside, reading to him from a book of poetry Hetty had said he loved, my voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet room. His eyes, which had been closed and unfocused, slowly opened and fixed on me. The fog was gone. He was entirely present, his gaze sharp and purposeful. "Celeste," he rasped, his voice weak but clear. I put the book down, my heart quickening. "I'm here, Silas." "We need to talk," he said, pushing himself up slightly on his pillows. "There are things that need to be settled." Over the next hour, he laid out his final wishes with the same no-nonsense practicality he had applied to everything in his life. He had already spoken with his lawyer. The business, he told me, was to be mine, free and clear. He had no other family, and he trusted no one else to carry on his legacy, but he didn't stop there. "The house, too," he continued, his breathing steady. "And the land. This is your home now, Celeste. Hetty's getting old. She needs someone to look after her, and you need roots, a place to call your own." The generosity of it was overwhelming. I tried to protest, to tell him it was too much, but he silenced me with a wave of his hand. "It's not a gift," he said sternly. "It's a payment. You saved it all. It's only right it belongs to you." He paused then, gathering his strength. He looked at me, his eyes holding an expression of such deep paternal affection that it made my own eyes well up with tears. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is going to sound crazy. And you can say no, but I need to ask." He took a long, ragged breath. "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air, so stunning, so completely unexpected that I couldn't speak. I just stared at him, my mind reeling. "It's not what you think," he said quickly, a faint blush rising on his pale cheeks. "I'm not a romantic old fool. This is practical. A marriage, a partnership. It will make everything simple. The transfer of the property, the legalities. It will make you my widow, my next of kin. It will give you a standing in this community that no one can ever question. It will protect you. It will protect Hetty. It will protect everything we've built." It was the most insane and yet the most logical proposition I had ever heard. It wasn't a proposal of passion, but of love, a deep, familial love, born of shared struggle and mutual respect. It was his final act of protection, his last gift to the woman he had pulled from the edge of a bridge. He was offering me his name, the final ultimate piece of his legacy, as a shield and a sanctuary for the rest of my life. "You don't have to answer now," he whispered, his energy fading. "Just think about it." He closed his eyes then, exhausted by the effort, and drifted into sleep, leaving me to grapple with the emotional weight of his request. I walked out of his room in a daze and found Hetty waiting for me in the hallway. One look at my face told her everything. "He asked you, didn't he?" she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. She pulled me into a warm, comforting hug. "He's a good man, Celeste," she murmured into my hair. "He just wants to know you'll be safe when he's gone." The next day, I drove into town in a fog, my mind consumed by Silas's proposal. Marriage. The very word was a minefield of pain and humiliation for me. Could I do it? Could I tie myself to another man, even in this unconventional way? I was so lost in thought that I almost drove past our main station. But I had payroll checks to drop off, a duty that even emotional turmoil couldn't erase. I pulled the truck into the lot, which was busy with the midday rush. As I was getting out, a car pulled up to one of the pumps, a flashy cherry-red convertible sports car, a ridiculous and impractical vehicle for a man in his 60s. And then I saw the driver. My blood ran cold. It was Dwayne. And in the passenger seat, looking bored and annoyed, was Tiffany, her blonde hair and ridiculously large sunglasses, a garish splash of color in the simple workaday world of the gas station. My first instinct was to flee, to get back in my truck and drive away, to hide from the ghost of my past. But then I stopped. Hide from what? From him? The man who had called me a cow, who had thrown me out of my own home? Why should I hide? This was my place. He was the intruder here. A cold, calm resolve settled over me. I stood my ground, my posture straightening, my chin lifting. Let him come. Let him see. The past had just pulled up to my front door, and I was about to show it how much the world had changed. Dwayne got out of the car with the stiff, self-conscious movements of a man trying to look younger than he was. He wore a tight-fitting polo shirt that strained over his paunch and a pair of designer jeans that looked utterly absurd on him. He didn't see me. His attention was focused entirely on the gas pump, which he seemed to be having trouble operating, a task he'd probably left to me for the past 30 years. Tiffany remained in the car, tapping impatiently on her phone, the very picture of youthful ennui. I watched him, a strange sense of detachment washing over me. The man who had once held the power to shatter my world now looked pathetic. A sad cliché, desperately trying to recapture his youth with a fast car and a young girl who clearly couldn't care less about him. The old wounds, the raw, gaping holes of betrayal and humiliation, were still there, but they no longer ached. They were scars, faded and numb. Earl came out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "Afternoon, Celeste," he said, his voice a familiar, comforting rumble. "Everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Earl," I said, my voice calm and even. Dwayne's head snapped up at the sound of my name. He squinted, his eyes slowly widening in disbelief as he took me in. He was seeing a stranger. The woman standing before him was not the weeping, broken creature he had discarded. This woman stood tall, her shoulders back, her gaze direct and steady. She was dressed in smart, professional clothes. She was radiating an aura of confidence and authority that he had never seen before. He looked from me to Earl, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Celeste," he said, the name a question, a statement of utter bewilderment. "What are you doing here? You work here?" The condescension in his tone was automatic, a reflex honed over decades. It was the only way he knew how to interact with me. Before I could answer, one of the young cashiers poked her head out the door of the convenience store. "Ms. Jones," she called out, "that delivery from Peterson's refinery is here. Where do you want them to park?" "Have them pull around back, Maria," I called back, my tone easy and authoritative. "I'll be right there to sign for it." The pieces clicked into place in Dwayne's mind. Miss Jones, the owner, the boss. The look that washed over his face was a spectacular, slow-motion car crash of emotions. First, confusion, then dawning comprehension, then pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw went slack and the color drained from his face. He looked from me to the bustling station, to the employees who greeted me with respect, to the name on the main sign, Silas Jones and Company. And his entire reality seemed to crumble. I had not just survived without him, I had ascended. I had moved on to a world where I was in charge, a world he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Tiffany, finally bored with her phone, got out of the car. "What's taking so long, honey?" she whined, then her eyes fell on me. "Oh, it's you." There was no triumph in her voice, only a faint, dismissive surprise. To her, I was just a footnote, a boring prelude to her own story. Dwayne, however, was still reeling. You own this place?" he stammered, gesturing vaguely at the station. "Silas Jones gave it to you?" "He did," I said simply. There was no need to explain the nuances of our relationship, the depth of what had passed between us. The simple fact was enough. It was more than enough. I saw it then, the thing I had unknowingly craved for months. Not an apology, not a confession of regret, but this moment of pure ego-crushing humiliation for him. The realization that the woman he had deemed worthless had in fact become priceless. The knowledge that he had not just thrown away a wife, he had thrown away a queen, and he hadn't even recognized the crown she was already wearing. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. What could he say? He had no power here. He was just a customer, and a slightly ridiculous-looking one at that. "If you'll excuse me, I have a delivery to sign for," I said, my voice cool and polite. It was a dismissal, as clean and final as the one he had given me all those months ago. I turned and walked toward the back of the station, not looking back. I could feel his eyes on me. His stare a mixture of disbelief, envy, and a dawning, terrible sense of loss. The confrontation I had dreaded, the encounter that I thought would rip open all my old scars, was over. And it had been nothing. It was like swatting away a fly. His presence was an annoyance, not a threat. His opinion was irrelevant. His power over me was gone, evaporated into the mundane afternoon air of my gas station. As I signed the delivery manifest, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The final chain had been broken. The last ghost had been exorcised. I was free, utterly and completely free. Dwayne was just a man in a silly red car, a relic from a life that no longer belonged to me. I had a new life now, a new family, and a new future waiting for me back at the farmhouse. And I knew with absolute certainty what my answer to Silas's proposal would be. I returned to the farmhouse that evening with a profound sense of peace. The encounter with Dwayne had been a final, clarifying gift. It had swept away the last lingering shadows of my old life and illuminated the path forward. I went straight to Silas's room. He was awake, and the light of gentle lucidity was in his eyes. I sat on the edge of his bed and took his frail, dry hand in mine. "Yes," I said softly, without any preamble. He looked at me, a question in his tired eyes. "Yes, I'll marry you." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile of relief and deep, abiding contentment. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." The wedding was 3 days later. It was not an event of pomp or circumstance, but of quiet, sacred meaning. We held it on the wide, wraparound porch of the farmhouse, the place where Silas had watched 1,000 sunsets, the place where I had first begun to feel safe. A traveling minister, a friend of Hetty's, came to officiate. The only guests were Hetty, her face a beautiful mixture of joy and sorrow, and Earl, who stood as Silas's best man, his usual skeptical frown replaced by a look of profound, solemn respect. I wore a simple cream-colored dress Hetty had helped me pick out. I didn't feel like a bride in the traditional sense. I felt like a daughter, a partner, a guardian of a legacy, formalizing a bond that had been forged in the deepest parts of the human heart. Silas was too weak to stand, so he sat in his wheelchair, dressed in his best Sunday suit, which hung loosely on his diminished frame. I knelt before him so we could be at eye level. The minister's words were simple and true, speaking not of romantic passion, but of devotion, companionship, and the making of a family. When it came time, I placed a simple gold band on Silas's finger, his hand trembling in mine. He had insisted on getting one for me as well, a plain, elegant ring that felt solid and real on my finger. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, I leaned in and kissed his dry, paper-thin cheek. "Thank you, Celeste Jones," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "No," I whispered back, my own tears beginning to fall. "Thank you, Silas." He passed away 2 days later, in his sleep, his hand holding mine. It was a peaceful end to a life lived with quiet dignity and fierce integrity. The grief was immense, a vast empty space in the fabric of our lives. But it was a clean grief, unburdened by regret. We had left nothing unsaid, nothing undone. Hetty and I mourned him together, our shared loss a bond that would never be broken. The funeral was small, attended by our employees and a handful of old friends from the town. They mourned the loss of a good man, a pillar of the community, but I mourned the loss of my savior. After the service, I found myself standing alone on the Hernando de Soto Bridge. I hadn't planned to come here, but my truck had seemed to drive itself. I stood on the same spot where I had been ready to end it all, the cold metal of the railing familiar beneath my hand. But the view was different now. It was not a dark, terrifying void, but a beautiful, powerful river, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. It was a river of life, of constant motion, of relentless forward momentum. A rusty pickup truck would not come screeching to a halt for me today. There were no more saviors coming. There didn't need to be. The woman on the bridge had been saved, but the woman standing here now was the savior. She was the one who saved businesses, who saved legacies, who saved herself. I looked down at the simple gold band on my finger. I was Celeste Jones, a widow, a business owner, a CEO, a survivor. I had been given a second chance at life, a gift from a grumpy angel in a rusty pickup truck, and I would not waste a single day of it. I turned away from the railing and walked back to my truck, my steps sure and steady. I had a business to run, a family to care for, and a life to live. The sun was warm on my face, and for the first time, the future did not feel like a threat, but like a promise. The story of the broken woman on the bridge was over. My story, the real story, was just beginning.